In a small forgotten town where hatred and division ran deep, an unexpected hero rolled in on two wheels, ready to change everything. Meet Marcus Johnson, a black biker with a big heart and an even bigger mission. But his journey wasn't about taking down the walls of prejudice with anger or force. No, Marcus had a far more powerful weapon: kindness. Little did he know, his simple act of generosity would stir up a firestorm in a place where racism was as ingrained as the very roads he rode on. It's easy to think of racism as something we only hear about in the history books or see in the headlines, but in some corners of the world, it's alive and well, taking root in the hearts of everyday people. And that's exactly what Marcus found when he stopped in the small town of Ashford, a place known for its cold stares and whispered slurs whenever someone from outside their narrow world came into town. Marcus wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't even looking for a fight. He was just passing through, on his bike, on his way to somewhere else. But fate had other plans. The moment Marcus rode into Ashford, the atmosphere seemed to shift. Eyes turned, whispers started. There was something about his presence. A black man, a biker, and someone who didn't seem like he belonged. Ashford had seen people like him before, but not with a smile and an open heart. What they saw in Marcus, however, was more than they could have expected. And it was in the simplest of gestures: a friendly wave, a warm greeting, a refusal to be anything but genuine, that things began to change. The hostility was palpable at first. It wasn't just the stares. It was the way the townspeople avoided him, made assumptions about his intentions, even went out of their way to make him feel unwelcome. But Marcus, ever the optimist, didn't let it faze him. He knew what it felt like to be judged by the color of his skin, to be treated like he didn't matter. But he wasn't about to return hatred with hatred. Instead, he decided to do something that no one saw coming. He started helping. Marcus noticed that Ashford's local diner was run down, the paint peeling off the walls, the tables long overdue for repairs. Without a word, he pulled out his tools and started working, offering to fix what had been neglected for years. At first, the diner's owner, an elderly man named Earl, was skeptical. What would a stranger, especially someone like Marcus, want with his business? But when Marcus insisted, offering to help for free, Earl reluctantly accepted. As the hours passed and Marcus worked, something changed. The old man softened, his once suspicious eyes now filled with gratitude. Word of Marcus's kindness began to spread, but not everyone was convinced. Some people in town whispered that he had an ulterior motive. Others thought it was just a trick. It was a town too used to a certain way of thinking to just let go of old grudges, to trust someone they had always been taught to fear. But Marcus didn't back down. He kept on working, showing up day after day, fixing not just buildings, but the relationships that had been broken over decades of mistrust. He didn't push anyone to change their mind or apologize for their past. He simply acted with grace and humility. Slowly, people began to take notice. The young man who had come into their town with nothing but a bike and a willingness to help had become the most unexpected bridge between two worlds that had never been able to meet. But even as the town started to shift, the real test was yet to come. The question was, would this one man's kindness be enough to break the chains of racism that had held Ashford captive for so long? Or would the weight of history prove too heavy to overcome? Just when it seemed like the town was on the cusp of something beautiful, a shocking event shook everything to its core. A group of local men who had never accepted Marcus's presence or the changes he was bringing were ready to make their stand. The tension in Ashford grew thicker by the day, and the question of whether Marcus's goodwill could truly change a town so steeped in hatred remained unanswered. Would his generosity be enough to win the hearts of the people who had spent so long hiding behind their fear? Or was the town too broken to ever truly heal? In the next part of this story, you'll witness how Marcus faces his greatest challenge yet and the unexpected allies he gains along the way. But will it be enough? Can one person's actions really change a town built on prejudice? Stick around because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about what it takes to overcome hate. The days following Marcus's first visit to Ashford were filled with a mix of curiosity and resistance. While some townspeople began to soften, the entrenched divisions were hard to ignore. Ashford had been built on old traditions, where suspicion of outsiders wasn't just a habit, it was a way of life. Generations had lived in the town, passing down unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. Racism, as ugly and uncomfortable as it was, had become a part of Ashford's identity. It wasn't just about hatred. It was about a way of seeing the world that had been taught for so long it felt like the truth. Marcus, however, wasn't here to challenge their beliefs with anger or confrontation. He wasn't there to break their walls down with a battering ram of political debates or loud speeches. Instead, he offered a different kind of challenge. His was a challenge of humanity, an invitation to look at each other as people, not labels. But this wasn't easy for everyone, and it certainly wasn't accepted by everyone either. At the heart of Ashford's resistance was a group of older men who held positions of influence in the town. They'd lived through the worst of the racial tensions during the civil rights era and had long since settled into their views that people like Marcus weren't welcome. They saw his kindness as a weakness, a way to pull the wool over their eyes. To them, his actions weren't generous. They were manipulative. And the last thing they wanted was for their town to be softened by someone they saw as an outsider, no matter how nice he was. One of these men, Hank Miller, was the most vocal in his opposition to Marcus. A veteran of the town's old guard, Hank had built his reputation on being the loudest voice in the room, the one who rallied the others with the familiar rhetoric of "this is our town," and "we've always done it this way." He didn't trust Marcus, and he didn't trust what he represented: change. When Marcus showed up at Earl's Diner, Hank took it as an affront, a sign that the town's way of life was under attack. But Marcus, undeterred by Hank's angry glares or the murmurs from the back of the diner, continued to show up every day. His reputation began to grow, not just as a fixer of broken things, but as a person who brought a sense of warmth that was missing in Ashford. Slowly, little by little, some of the younger residents started to speak up. There was Jesse, a high school teacher who had never fully agreed with the town's prejudices, but had stayed silent for years out of fear. There was Amy, a single mother who worked at the local grocery store and had always wanted to make a change, but didn't know where to start. These were the people who began to notice Marcus's impact, and they began to wonder, could it be possible that things could change? It was Jess who first tried to break the silence, quietly starting conversations with Marcus whenever they crossed paths. He'd ask about his life, his family, and why he was willing to spend so much time helping people who hadn't exactly shown him much kindness. Marcus would always answer with the same words: because we're all human. For Jesse, it was the beginning of a slow but steady realization. He started to see the walls of division for what they were: constructs built on years of misinformation and fear. And slowly, Marcus's message started to break through. But Hank wasn't the type of man to sit idly by while someone tried to disrupt the balance of his world. As Marcus's efforts to improve the diner and other parts of the town continued, the tension started to build. Hank and his friends grew more and more uncomfortable, feeling threatened by the changes happening before their eyes. The idea that a black man could come into their town, show kindness, and begin to shift the way people thought. It was simply too much for them to handle. One evening, things came to a head. As the sun set, Marcus was working on fixing a broken fence behind the diner when Hank and a few of his friends appeared. They didn't speak immediately. Instead, they watched him from the other side of the yard, their eyes narrow, their postures stiff with hostility. Marcus, ever calm, didn't stop what he was doing. He knew this moment was coming. He just didn't know when. Finally, Hank spoke. "You think you can just waltz into our town and change things, don't you?" he said, his voice thick with contempt. Marcus stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't answer right away. He'd heard the same words before in other towns, other places, from people who were too afraid to let go of their old ways. But there was something about Hank, something that told Marcus the man was more frightened than he was angry. "I'm not here to change anyone, Hank," Marcus said quietly. "I'm just here to help. If you want to change something, change the way you see people." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, but Hank wasn't having it. He stepped forward, his voice rising. "This is our town, our rules. You don't belong here, and neither do your kind." The words stung, but Marcus didn't flinch. "I've seen towns like this before," he replied. "But it doesn't have to stay this way." As the conversation heated, the onlookers from the town started to gather, drawn by the commotion. The tension was unbearable. In that moment, it felt like everything was on the brink of exploding. Would the town split into two, forever divided by the past? Or would Marcus's message of humanity be enough to push through just as things seemed to be spiraling out of control? Something unexpected happened. Jesse, the teacher, stepped forward. "You know what? I don't care about your rules anymore," he said to Hank, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I don't care about the way things have always been. What I care about is making this town a place where we can all look at each other and see people. Good people." The crowd grew silent. Hank's face reddened, but he said nothing. For a moment, it looked like everything was about to break wide open, the town on the edge of a transformation, one way or the other. But as the silence lingered, a car drove up the road, breaking the tension. And in that moment, no one knew if the peace that had been so carefully built would hold. What happened next would change everything. Would the town listen, or would the forces of hate and fear be too strong to overcome? The car that rolled into Ashford wasn't anything special, just a dusty old sedan. But the man stepping out of it was. His name was Officer James Carter, a former member of Ashford's police force who had moved away many years ago. He was returning to the town after a long absence, his eyes scanning the familiar streets with a sense of both nostalgia and unease. He hadn't been back since the racial tensions had been at their worst, when people like him had been complicit in the system that kept divisions strong. The crowd at the diner parted as Officer Carter walked through, his eyes lingering on the small gathering of people standing at the center of the argument. Hank, still red-faced, stood in the middle, arms crossed, while Marcus remained calm, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Jesse, standing at the forefront, was waiting for something, anything, that might tip the balance. "I hear there's a problem here," Officer Carter said, his voice steady but laced with an undeniable tension. The people of Ashford recognized him, but there was an uncertainty in the way they looked at him now. He wasn't the man they remembered. He wasn't wearing the same uniform of authority that once demanded respect. He was a different man altogether. Hank's eyes narrowed. "Carter, this is none of your business," he growled. "This man, this outsider, is messing with our town." Marcus looked up at Officer Carter, unsure of where his allegiance lay. For a moment, the air was thick with uncertainty, and it felt like everything could come crashing down. But then Carter surprised them all. "Actually, Hank, I think it is my business," he said. His eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time in a long while, a genuine expression of remorse appeared on his face. "I wasn't always proud of the way things were in this town. I turned a blind eye to the hatred and the division. I stood by while people like Marcus were treated like they didn't matter. But I've seen things differently now. And I think it's time this town saw things differently too." There was a collective gasp from the crowd. Hank stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You can't be serious, Carter. You're just going to let him waltz in here and take over." "I'm not saying he's taking over," Carter replied, "but I'm saying we have a chance to change something here. And maybe, just maybe, it starts with us. It starts with us looking at each other like human beings, not like strangers. We've all been blind to this town's problems for far too long." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Some were in shock, others were hopeful, but it was clear that this moment was different. The tides had shifted. Carter took a step forward, his voice rising with conviction. "Hank, I know you think you're protecting this town, but you're only holding it back. We can't keep pretending like things aren't broken. And if we don't fix them now, we'll lose something much more important, our humanity." The weight of his words seemed to hit Hank like a punch to the gut. For the first time in years, Hank looked uncertain. His eyes flicked to the people around him, his friends, his neighbors, and saw that they weren't looking at him the same way they once had. He had been their leader, their guide, but now he was the one standing alone. Jesse took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We don't have to be afraid anymore, Hank. We've all been taught fear, but it's time to learn something else. It's time to learn love and understanding. We can make Ashford a place that's different. We don't need to hold on to the past anymore." The town held its breath, waiting for Hank's response. For a moment, he was silent, his eyes shifting between the people gathered, the ones who had been following his lead for so long. It was as if time itself had stopped. Then finally, Hank's shoulders sagged. The anger, the fear, the pride, all of it seemed to evaporate in the face of the growing movement around him. "You're right," Hank said, his voice barely a whisper, though the words carried more weight than anyone had expected. "Maybe it's time to let go." And with that, something incredible happened. The crowd that had gathered, which had been divided and tense moments before, began to soften. People who had lived their entire lives in Ashford, trapped in the cycle of hate and suspicion, were now seeing something new. They were seeing each other, not as enemies or strangers, but as neighbors, as people who could share a future together. Marcus smiled, though it was a smile tinged with exhaustion. It had taken everything he had to get to this point. He had faced down his own fears, his own frustrations, but now he stood at the edge of something beautiful. Something that was just beginning to take root in the hearts of the people of Ashford. The next few months were a whirlwind of change. The town began to rebuild, not just the crumbling buildings, but the broken relationships that had festered for so long. People who had once whispered in fear began to speak openly. The diner, which had once been a symbol of division, became a place of unity. Marcus continued his work, not as a savior, but as a man who saw the potential for something better. And Hank. He became a reluctant ally, one who would never forget the lessons he'd learned. He started to speak out against the divisions that had once seemed so natural to him. His past was still there, still weighing on his conscience. But for the first time in a long time, he was choosing to walk a different path. The change wasn't instant, and it wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the old ways tried to creep back in. But the people of Ashford knew something now that they hadn't known before. Change was possible. And it started with the smallest of gestures, the kind of generosity Marcus had shown. the kind that didn't ask for anything in return, but was simply given in the spirit of kindness. As for Marcus, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be perfect. There would always be challenges, always moments of tension. But in his heart, he knew that he had changed the course of Ashford's future. And in doing so, he had shown the world that a single act of generosity could be the spark that set off a fire of change. And that fire, like the road ahead, was only just beginning to burn.